much of our current efforts gravitate around building relationships and fostering conversations between scholars in and off the African and Asian continents across research fields related to global challenges such as inequality and human development, democracy and human rights, and sustainability and environmental justice. CASA also aspires to serve as a platform for dialogues that explore both historical and contemporary Afro-Asian connections, and the role that these connections have played and continue to play in driving profoundly consequential transformations in the world system. It is very fitting, therefore, that our first webinar is dedicated to a discussion of an incredibly fascinating new book titled The Lives of Cold-War Afro-Asianism. The book is edited by Carolien Lewis and Carolien Stolte, who are with us for today's session, and it was published by Amsterdam University Press late last year. This edited collection offers us an incredibly rich and compelling portrait of Afro-Asianism as a transformative social movement and political project. Very significantly, the book departs from the tendency to equate the Afro-Asianism of the early Cold War with the high diplomacy of the Bandung project, and directs our attention instead to the different visions of post-colonial world-making that existed alongside of it. Focusing on Afro-Asianism as what Carolien and Carolien in their introduction refers to as a living network nourished by connections through political activism at both the local and an international level. The book takes us beyond state centrism and offers a view of a profoundly polyphonic internationalism. There's a superb set of essays in this book which sheds new light on the hard work of Afro-Asian solidarity and which offers us a new and fuller picture of the politics of decolonization. Now, let me introduce our speakers in a little bit more detail. Carolien Lewis is Associate Professor in Modern Global History at the University of Bristol in the UK. Carolien specializes in the field of global and transnational history in the 20th century, with a particular interest in urban history, civil society and activist networks, gender, migration, decolonization and development in the 20th century. Her award-winning monograph titled Cities in Motion, Urban Life and Cosmopolitanism in Southeast Asia, 1920 to 1940, was published in 2016 by Cambridge University Press and focuses on the cosmopolitan port city as a site of cross-cultural interactions and experimentations with modernity in Southeast Asia. Carolien Stolte is Assistant Professor at Leiden University, where she works on the international history of South Asia. Her current project, Southern Crossings, Indian Activists and the Afro-Asian Movement in the Early Cold War, focuses on Indian trade unionists, peace activists, and feminists in the Afro-Asian movement. Her work has been widely published in journals such as Modern Asian Studies, Comparative Studies in Society and History, Journal of World History, and also Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. She has co-edited numerous books, the most recent one, of course, being The Lives of Cold-War Afro-Asianism, which we're discussing today. Joining us as discussant is my colleague Tula Simpson, who is Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Pretoria. Tula is a historian of modern South Africa and the author of two major trailblazing books. His first book was a chronicle of the ANC's armed struggle, published in 2016 by Penguin Random House. And this book has been hailed as the very definite account of this aspect of the struggle for liberation in South Africa. His second book appeared last year and is titled History of South Africa, 1902 to the Present. The book is published by Oxford University Press, and it won the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences Nonfiction Book Award for 2022. So it's time for me to hand over to the presenters. Carolien and Carolien will talk for about 40 minutes about the book, and we will then give the floor to Tula for comments. And after a response from Carolien and Carolien, we'll open for questions from the audience, which you guys can put in the chat. Or if you want to use the mic, you can do so. If you put it in the chat, I'll read it out for you. Housekeeping, this is being recorded. We are going to share it on our YouTube channel. And other than that, I would like to ask Carolien and Carolien to take it away.
Thank you very much, Alf, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here for the launch of the center. So I don't know if we'll talk for 40 minutes. Well, we might do. You always think that you're going to talk for a shorter time, but I want to leave plenty of room for discussion. So to introduce the book, so just to introduce, well, you've already done a wonderful introduction of Carolien and I, so I think we can go forward to just talk about the project. Carolien, if you could go to the next slide. So the book really stems from a larger project that started in 2015, the Afro-Asian Networks Project, which was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. If you want to learn more about the project, we have a website, afroasiannetworks.com, and we also have quite a vibrant blog on medium.com, Afro-Asian Visions, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the recent posts we've had on that. So the project really stemmed from trying to get a group of researchers together to think about the kind of idea of Afro-Asianism and this kind of moment of third world internationalism from multiple perspectives, from multiple regional and linguistic and perspectives, to bring their own expertise. Carolien, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So as Alf mentioned, this is really an attempt to kind of move away from the high diplomacy of Bandung, which has so often been seen as the birthplace of third world internationalism. And we can see from the photographs of the way in which this conference has tended to be characterized. It tends to be statesmen, it tends to be male, they tend to be quite charismatic. And I think that these particular figures, Nasser, Nehru, UNU, Zhou Enlai, have tended to dominate the narrative and kind of thinking about who they are and the kind of diplomacy that they practiced. If we go to the next slide, please. So we wanted to kind of open this up and think about Afro-Asianism from a much broader level, and think about the kind of activists, the intellectuals, the artists, and the kind of other kinds of political leaders that were involved in thinking about Afro-Asian movements and practicing Afro-Asian movements. We tended to, for much of the project, we tended to focus on other kinds of conferences because they gave us a good grounding in kind of thinking about the points in which, and the meeting places and the gathering points where some of these figures were able to meet and have these conversations across transnational lines. And these are kind of some of the conferences that we were looking at. And there are points of connection between them, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but really kind of beginning with the Asian Relations Conference in Delhi, moving on to the Asia Pacific Peace Conference in Beijing, the Asian Socialist Conference in Rangoon, which I'll talk about shortly, the Conference of Asian Countries on the Relaxation of International Tensions, or what was often called the People's Bandung, which happened about 5 days before the Bandung Conference in Delhi. Carolien will say more about that. And of course, we had to kind of think about Bandung as well. And the kind of observers and figures and the marginal figures that were at Bandung. The Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization Conference in Cairo in 57, the Afro-Asian Writers Conference in Tashkent, the All Africa People's Conference in Accra. And that helped us think a little bit more about kind of different kinds of regionalisms and how those emerge alongside or in conversation or in engagement with some of these Afro-Asian movements. In 1960, the second Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Conference in Conakry, and 1961, the first Afro-Asian Women's Conference in Cairo, which was not actually the first, because I've been working on a new piece about the Afro-Asian Conference of Women that happened in Colombo in 1958. And then the first Afro-Asian Latin American People's Solidarity Conference, or the Tricontinental, in Havana. And some of those conferences we covered in a special issue in the Journal of World History called Other Bandungs. Many of those articles are in this new volume. and have been kind of shortened and edited. But we also have a range of other articles and pieces, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Carolien, can you move ahead? Part of the, one of the offshoots of the project was designing a visualization where we could really kind of picture some of the conferences and where people were coming from. And this was generously funded by the Brigstow Institute at the University of Bristol. And that helped us. So if you look at the visualization, all the kind of lines that are coming to particular conferences are lines that reflect the individuals that came from the conference and where they came from. And the thicknesses indicate the kind of that there were more delegates from that particular country. And you can kind of click on the delegates and see if they were at other conferences as well. And you can click through to kind of look at the events of the conferences themselves, the people that attended. You can click on those people and get a little biographies of some of them, and really get a sense of, you know, where people are coming from. So you can see some of these major conferences here, and, you know, the kind of reach of the Tricontinental in '66, which emerged in conversation and dialogue and in a kind of engagement with some of these early Afro-Asian movements. And then you have the All Africa People's Conference. And then these are some of the earlier conferences that were leading up to Bandung. So we have the Asian Relations Conference, the Asian Socialist Conference, which I'll speak more about, as well as the Asian African Conference. And you can see that this figure at the bottom here, Sojat Moko, an Indonesian intellectual, was at all three of those conferences. And then ended up being quite a powerful figure later on within the United Nations. He was rector of the UN University in Tokyo, so he was operating in that very international sphere. So part of the volume was very interested, less so in the conference's events, which was the kind of focus of the special issue, but also the lives of the people, the lives of the conferences, the lives of Afro-Asianism, but also the lives of particular figures. One of the things that came out of this study was also kind of thinking about the way in which the visualization maps onto particular airline routes and particular hubs. This is the new kind of jet age, the rise of the airplane as a vehicle to kind of bring people to those conferences at a much kind of a much quicker rate. And if anyone's interested, I've got a blog post about this on our blog, as well as a new chapter that came out in the Placing Internationalism, a volume about conferences and mobility, which talks about the kind of importance of not only the conference sites, but the journeys that people took to get to those conferences, the meetings that happened along the way, the kind of the layovers, the way that the layovers often shaped delegates' imaginations of Afro-Asia, of kind of the challenges of development in particular countries. And that was particularly true of, and we have some wonderful resources and material from the writers that went to the Afro-Asian Writers Conference in Tashkent, who are describing the kind of, you know, what they went through when they were transiting through Delhi, or transiting and boarding the kind of Soviet Aeroflot airplane for the first time, and understanding the kind of power of the Soviet Union and the modernity. So it's a really fascinating element to think about the kind of material aspects of these conferences and how they are bringing people together. Alongside the transportation, the way people were getting there, we were also thinking a lot about language and the way in which language facilitates a certain kind of facilities in English at some of the conferences, like the Asian Socialist Conference, help facilitate that communication. But at other conferences, which Carolien might say something about, we have kind of, you know, translation happening, and we have multiple languages emerging. So the Asian Socialist Conference, which was my chapter, I was interested in these particular group of socialists that had met on the fringes of the Asian Relations Conference in 1947. And they were socialist leaders, often in opposition to the main political parties. So we have figures like Sultan Syahrir, who was instrumental in designing the first constitution of Indonesia. He was the first prime minister, but then emerged in political opposition to Sukarno and the Socialist Party, which was then sidelined in kind of Indonesian politics, but nonetheless played a very important intellectual role that continued from the 50s onwards. And that's a project that I'm working on, especially at the moment, to kind of continue continue kind of research into this realm of socialist internationalism in Asia, in particular Southeast Asia. So you see here Syahrir arriving for the first Asian Socialist Conference on the tarmac with an airplane behind him, being greeted by leaders of the Burmese Socialist Party. And you see the kind of friendship and the kind of intimacy between these figures in the photograph. And you can see some of that in some of the photographs. In one of the photographs I'll be showing that kind of show the way in which these figures kind of interrelated to each other. So that conference, it was not just a one-off conference. It happened in Rangoon in 1953, which was Rangoon at that time was a real kind of hub of internationalism. You had kind of, actually freedom fighters from Africa and from Tunisia, from Uganda, coming to Rangoon, being sponsored by the Burmese government, which was the kind of the kind of only nominally socialist government that was really in power in Asia at that time. Just to go back, Carolien, to that one for a minute, and that conference then there was an organization that emerged in between that conference and the second socialist conference that happened in Bombay in 1956. After the Bombay conference, a lot of these socialist parties start imploding, and the movement itself falls apart. But as I'm hoping to show in this new research, there are other ways in which it kind of emerges and becomes still continually important in other areas of Southeast Asia, including Malaysia and Singapore. Next slide. So the Asian Socialist Conference itself wasn't just an event, it was also an organization. So it had an office in Rangoon that published a lot of socialist literature, trying to serve as a forum for multiple socialist parties to come together and to converse with each other. It also was very in favor of Afro-Asian solidarity. So 2 years before the Bandung Conference, the Asian Socialist Conference was promoting the idea of Afro-Asian solidarity. They published, alongside Socialist Asia, a publication called the Anti-Colonial Bureau, which was actually edited by a Ghanaian sort of journalist, politician called James Markham, who ended up being one of the 3 delegates at the Asian Socialist Conference. And one of our contributors, Jared McCann, wrote quite a bit about this in his chapter in the volume, which has a wonderful title called "Where is the Afro in Afro-Asia?" And I'll talk a little bit about the kind of African coverage within the volume in a little bit. But Markham was the editor of the Anti-Colonial Bureau, which covered multiple freedom movements all over the African continent, as well as the independence movement in Malaya, which did not get independence until 1957, unlike a number of other Asian countries. So it becomes a really fascinating forum. If you could go to the next slide, Carolien. And recently I found a photograph of Markham at the Asian Socialist Conference offices. So here we are in this kind of personal photograph album of Markham at the center of this group of Asian socialists from Japan, from India, from Indonesia. And it was a very kind of close-knit group of figures, which I'm hoping to write more about in this current project. But I want to bring it back to Carolien, who's going to come back and talk more about some of the conferences that we were looking at. Oh, before I do that, sorry, I forgot that we had shifted the slides around, but the kind of the coverage of the volume, we have to admit, is a lot of it is looking at Asia, and a kind of Asia as a site where we have the kind of ideas of Afro-Asianism. We have Bandung, we have a number of these conferences where some of these conversations are beginning to happen. Apart from conferences, we also have a couple contributions to the volume that are not about conferences at all, but about kind of Asian connections to the African continent, including Tico van der Hulk's piece about Juche centers, the kind of North Korean ideology centers across the continent. He's recently written a blog post about this on our blog, medium.com, Afro-Asian Visions. So if anyone's interested in just kind of dipping into the idea of what Tico is writing about, it's a fascinating post, and he's got a much longer version in the volume. So I'll hand it over to Carolien now.
Great, thank you so much. So what I'm gonna do, is talk a little bit about departing from my own chapter, kind of going the opposite direction, start small, and then hopefully launch into some of the choices we made with the volume at large. Because this Conference of Asian Countries on the Relaxation of International Tensions, or rather the CRIT, that I write about in the volume. Yeah, Sulin already said it was kind of known as the People's Bandung, because it was much more kind of mass-based public gathering, right, in contrast to Bandung, which was close to the public, and taking place just 11 days before. But the visuals that I have right here are also, I think, why it's so important to sort of widen this orbit of conferences and talk about these other meetings that took place, because we really have no better visuals than this one, right? There's a postcard just of the site, the Hotel Imperial in New Delhi, and of Lady Urban College here on the right side of the slide, which was a key site in kind of the social spaces around the conference where a lot of meetings and receptions took place. Throughout the volume, we've kind of added what pictorial evidence that we have, but it's important to note, I think, that the really kind of graininess of the pictures, the very kind of black and white nature of the pictures we have of these non-Bandungs that didn't have, you know, the same kind of journalistic coverage, the same type of global attention that moments like Bandung got, right? Kind of the more high diplomatic moments is very telling, I think, of also the, you know, the need to incorporate these other conferences as well. So the Conference of Asian Countries on the Relaxation of International Tension, kind of the name already says it was a peace conference, and organized within the orbit of something called the All India Peace Conference, which was itself a subsidiary of the World Peace Council in the Soviet Union, which effectively functioned as an arm of Soviet foreign policy. And a lot of the work on kind of the World Peace Council and the organizations in its orbit has, as a result, traditionally been incredibly Soviet focused, right? And if Afro-Asian actors emerge in these types of histories, it's very often kind of as, either duped activists, right, who are kind of mistakenly guided into this World Peace Council narrative that casts the Soviet Union as an anti-imperialist actor, or as kind of activists slotted into a very kind of narrow communist framework. And what I hope the approach that we've taken in this volume and in the project at large bears out is that this is an incredibly reductive narrative. It obscures a lot of Afro-Asian interactions that took place, but it also obscures the many ways in which African and Asian activists in this period used networks like those of the World Peace Council to further their own agendas, right? And in many ways actually subverted those narratives, and taking these Afro-Asian activists as the starting point for narratives rather than an institutional space like the World Peace Council enables, you know, the writing of very different histories. And this is where a conference like the CRIT, even though you have to sort of cobble the information on it together from many different personal archives and other accounts, because there's no sort of official archive of it, no neat delegate lists or anything. It's worthwhile for those reasons. And also, the lack of a delegate list doesn't mean we can't know who is there, right? There's a lot of continuities we can chase. Also, the ways in which these different conference spaces hang together through personal archives. And again, this is why the book is called The Lives of Afro-Asianism. In part, it's these personal connections that to a large extent kind of hold this network together. So one example is an Indian peace activist called Damodar Dharmananda Kosambi, not only known as peace activist, but I'll talk about him as a peace activist here, who was a vice chairman of the All India Peace Council and actually traveled to Beijing, the conference you see on the slide here, to attend the preparatory meeting for the larger Asia Pacific Peace Conference in 1952, so later that year. Now, at the time, Kosambi was a prominent scientist on the staff of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research and had increasingly kind of been drawn into the world peace movement since the early 1950s, campaigning relentlessly over the next decade against nuclearization of the world. So Kosambi actually wrote an account of this preparatory meeting for the APC shortly afterwards, describing it as a grand, inspiring affair in which no expense was spared. And Guo, so the romantic turned socialist chairman of the China Peace Committee, opens the ceremony here with a stirring speech kind of warning of amassing violence in Asia, highlighting the crucial position of the Asia-Pacific region in the quest for world peace. And we can trace through accounts like these, we can trace Kosambi kind of backwards and forwards in time along the intersections of Afro-Asianism and this global peace movement. So for instance, Kosambi, a little bit earlier in 1949 in New York, was the only delegate from the decolonizing world in a conference that actually kind of had styled itself as a global conference for peace. And this is also, I think, why it's really rewarding, kind of in a historiographical sense, to depart from these types of peace activists, because what he did in New York was kind of take the entire conference to task for its complete and total lack of representation. And just a quick quote here where he says, "You are using a far more terrible means of warfare than the bacteriological or the atomic. You are using it against the newly born democracies of a fairly important part of the world, Asia, an area of the globe which you would do well to bring into closer harmony with your partial and rather distorted point of view." Right, so this gives a sense of kind of the direction this peace movement is taking, but also does totally not, right, give the sense of a quest for inclusion, right? This is a movement with very much with an agenda of its own. And one of the things that it resulted in was, in fact, the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization, right? So this too, as obviously much more well-known, it became a lot larger than its parent and a lot wider, more representative and kind of more important to Afro-Asianism all around. But this too emerged both in terms of funding, of money and participation from these earlier peace meetings. And this is, again, why lives are so important. So I'll quickly take one example, which is Rameshwari Nehru, who you see speaking on the left side. It is actually one of the last international conferences she attended. So this is the Cairo conference in 1957 of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization, which was a direct successor of this 1955 CRIT conference. And this illustrates, I think, why we need both the lives, right, these lived histories, and the places where these lives intersected, right, which are the conferences. Because these conferences allow for sort of a freeze frame of these networks. Here we do have a delegate list. We know everyone who is there, and placing all these lives in a single space, in a single conversation together. And the lives, meanwhile, then allow us to kind of trace this network to the places where institutional records fill us, right, as historians. So the lives of Afro-Asianism, this is, again, taking the example of Rameshwari Nehru. It's why I've shown this picture from 1931 here, right, dipping back. Official records offer Afro-Asianism, and Celine already alluded to this with an earlier slide, as quite a homosocial space, right? This is a space of men and very charismatic men. But if we trace a lot of these lives, a very different picture emerges. And you see moments like the 1931 first All Asia Women's Conference, which took place in Lahore, as a start point for a network between women's rights activists from India, from Persia, from a lot of other spaces, that you then see meeting again in these later Afro-Asian moments. So there's a reason the 1947 Asian Relations Conference in New Delhi looked like this. So the All India Women's Council demanded that every delegation be asked to include at least one female delegate in its official delegation. This is in the end what Nehru ended up putting on the invitation to the Asian Relations Conference, and to which a lot of delegations responded. But if you look at the women who actually showed up in Delhi in 1947, a lot of these were already members of this earlier network that was already in place since the 1930s. Finally, there's of course also a lot of things that we don't see, right? So Celine has talked about socialist internationalism. These crit to APSO kind of trajectories are very much about kind of the Soviet-oriented, lightly Soviet-oriented side of the peace movement. But we should really talk about peace movement in the plural, because there were many and it was really important. So what we hoped to do with the book is offer as rich a variety as we could, given limited space, obviously, of these many lives of Afro-Asianism. We also wanted to show that all of these Afro-Asianisms are connected, right, often through individuals rather than institutional links, and that a lot of the organizational learning and sharing that you see also took place along the vectors of these personal connections. So this brings out a network, we hope, kind of with its fuzzy edges and the spin-off initiatives in its orbit. But I also want to talk for a quick second about what we risk missing in this way, and why it's so important also to do a project like this collectively, right, with a group as we did, and aggregating deep regional expertise. So to talk about an example from my own also more current research, the peace movement in South Asia, which was, well, the cradle of many Afro-Asian initiatives, was in fact two peace movements. So they had important elements in common, which is why kind of they both belong in these types of narratives. They were anti-imperialist, first and foremost, and believed that full and complete decolonization was a prerequisite for world peace. But their methods were crucially different. And this is where, well, again, language is important. Peace and pacifism are not quite the same, right? And pacifism is the domain also of a more religiously inflected internationalism that, although not invisible, is a lot less prominent in the Afro-Asianism we recover in this book. So really quickly, there's also a world here of Gandhians and Quakers and conscientious objectors. And what you see on the right side is American civil rights activist Bayard Rustin speaking at a rally for Zambian independence in Dar es Salaam in 1962. And in fact, Bayard Rustin kind of links the Gandhian movement. He toured India in the 1940s, attended sessions of the Indian National Congress with an Afro-Asian effort that was the Africa Freedom Action of the World Peace Brigade. This is an absolutely fascinating moment kind of on the other side of the spectrum of the peace and anti-nuclear movement in a very specific Afro-Asian inflection. Because what you see here, and this is why it's not rendered completely visible to networks of those like the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Conference, is something that is initially organized under the auspices of the War Resisters International, right? So a very kind of London-based European pacifist organization with roots in the conscientious objection of the First World War, becoming a, well, kind of erecting this World Peace Brigade, which was first and foremost intended to assist decolonization efforts. And they chose Zambia as kind of their first and primary case. And this effort was supposed to kind of bring pacifist volunteers to East Africa to march in a very, very massive peace march in favor of Zambian independence. And this is where you see a lot of pacifists kind of shying away, afraid of the risk that, you know, this would erupt in violence. And what ends up happening is that this effort takes place, becomes entirely directed from the Indian side, and you see a shift of these decolonization efforts from this War Resisters International in London to its Asian regional office, which was based in India. So there are parallel trajectories here, but they kind of end up in the same place. So this is why, one of the things we most enjoyed about this project was assembling a larger group that has these kind of linguistic and regional archival expertise. Just the picture is years old by now, but the way we were able actually to bring a lot of these conferences, networks, delegate lists together in order to show these networks, create the visualization, and kind of bring out how these different peace initiatives, socialist initiatives, communist initiatives, etc., hang together, was by engaging in something we called the Collaborative Research Week, where the entire group kind of dived into the same archive together in order to hopefully have a lot of individual projects becoming more than the sum of its parts. So the archive we went to was the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam, where the full kind of archives of organizations like the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, the International Union of Socialist Youth, and a lot of similar organizations exist. And what became kind of one of the wonderful things about a collaborative methodology like that is that you end up connecting bits that you would never have found in the archives you would normally use for your own international project, right? So if you have a group in the reading room and one person is going through a trade union conference in, well, in this particular case, I think it was in Nigeria, and coming across an Asian trade unionists that you know that somebody else in the group is looking at, right? And you can immediately walk over and say, look, I found this person in this place where you would never expect him. Right, so this was, I think, one of the ways in which the start of the project worked quite well, because in this way you can really kind of bring out connections that you could never sort of find in your own individual archive. So back to the book, because I know I've been talking for a while. We didn't want to impose unity where it doesn't fully exist, right? Because of the organic nature of the work. We do roughly have three parts. We talk about democratic socialist forms of Afro-Asianism, more Soviet-linked forms of Afro-Asianism, and then finally turn to tricontinentalism from the mid-1960s onwards. But those labels don't fully work, of course, because all of these spaces and individuals were linked through relationships that really don't let themselves be reduced to a single political label. So instead, we included three poems from the Indonesia Sings of Afro-Asia book that was created for the Afro-Asian Writers' Conference of 1962, again, which took place in Cairo. So the poems themselves, they're by three different poets, but they, we kind of use them to roughly indicate that a new life, a new incarnation of Afro-Asianism is starting in the book. So this particular one is by Sito Semurang, which I think is especially fitting, given that he was one of the contacts of American civil rights activist Richard Wright during his trip to Indonesia for the Bandung Conference. So like Richard Wright himself, Sito Semurang was inspired by the Bandung Conference and sort of started an Afro-Asian career from there, and not least as a delegate to the second Afro-Asian Writers' Conference in '62. So this book, Indonesia Sings of Afro-Asia, was an anthology of Afro-Asian inspired poems by prominent Indonesian poets, kind of created especially for this conference. And Sito Semurang himself later became a prominent member of the Institute of National Culture, the Lembaga Kebudayaan Nasional, which was an institution linked closely to Sukarno, which partly also led to his detention without trial in 1965, right? And he was not released until 1976. And this is especially kind of a trajectory that Tamo Jo talks about much more extensively in her chapter in the book, which covers the life of Francisca Vangede, whose leftist activism had a very similar kind of parallel trajectory. So finally, the obligatory slide, but there's one thing I really do want to highlight here, because we want this book to be as accessible as possible. And obviously the sticker price for the hard copy is quite staggering, as these often are. I just wanted to highlight that it's now fully accessible, the digital version of it, on Project Muse, which is something a lot more libraries probably will look favorably towards. So the table of contents, the introduction that Celine and I wrote is open access anyways through the publisher's site. But now the full version is on Project Muse as well. And I think this might be a good moment for us to turn it back over.
Thank you so much, not only for a fantastic presentation about the book itself, but for letting us see some of the collective process that has yielded the book. That was really fascinating. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Tula for comments. Tula, 10 minutes or so. Is that okay?
Thank you very much, Professor Nielsen, for that introduction. One of the book's objectives, as the editors have repeatedly stated, is to move beyond the dominance of the focus on the high diplomacy of Bandung, which has prevailed in the literature thus far. In the South African context, besides Brian Bunting's biographical account of Moses Katani's attendance of the conference in Bandung, however, Bandung has scarcely registered any imprint on the country's historical consciousness. The conference does not feature in any of the leading general histories of South Africa, but that's also somewhat misleading, as I want to briefly explore in my response. I'll take my inspiration from Gerard McCann's chapter on Where Was the Afro and Afro-Asian Solidarity, and Taiko van der Hoef's North Korean Cultural Diplomacy During the Liberation of Southern Africa, 2 chapters in the book. McCann's chapter offers excellent coverage on West and East African states, while van der Hoef focuses on North Korea's attempts to spread Juche, its own brand of socialist ideology, to Southern Africa. But his incisive account falls on countries north of the Limpopo, particularly Zimbabwe. I want to engage with the light that I believe many contributions in the book throw on the importance of the Afro-Asiatic moment in South African history, and by incorporating South Africa's similarities with these broader processes, I hope at the same time to introduce possible contrasts that could serve to throw new perspectives on that broader story of solidarity and transnational connection. Some chapters in the book refer to an earlier collection on the League Against Imperialism published by Leiden University Press in 2020. It was famously in the South African context through the mediation of the League that Josiah Gumede, the ANC's President General in the 1920s, began his rapprochement with the South African Communist Party. Gumede's initiative failed as a result of internal reaction within the ANC, but by the 1950s, the organization's leftward tilt had resumed, and I would argue that the Afro-Asian moment played a key role in this. The ANC's commitment to non-violence during the 1950s is often referred to, but a key distinction is often overlooked, namely the incompatibility between Gandhian notions of sole force and the ANC's tactics of trying to render society ungovernable and politics as usual unworkable. The overtone of violence was palpable during the 1950s, including to the state, whose detectives have preserved for posterity what was actually being said at those supposedly peaceful gatherings by Nelson Mandela and others. They were referring to processes in China, Indochina, Korea, Malaya, also as well in Africa with Mau Mau, of armed rebellion and victory, and they were calling for black South Africans, to emulate those feats. In terms that would be used by the state in the 1980s, the South African regime was worried about the creation of a revolutionary climate and those meetings, supposedly non-violent meetings, being used to generate that. The speeches formed the core of the state's case in the treason trial from 1956 to 1961. The state could not prove a conspiracy and therefore all of the activists were acquitted, but the state could sense something was changing, and in that regard, their instincts were valid. This identifies an important difference between South Africa and many of the nations present at Bandung, namely that Sukarno, Nehru and others had achieved their liberation, while movements in the Southern Africa had barely commenced their struggles. There was in short a distinction of interest. Their struggles were at different stages of progression. If Bandung has received little interest, Walter Sisulu's 1953 visit to China has gained wide attention as being an important precursor of what was to come in South Africa. In other words, in his chapter, Van der Hoef points out that he wants to decenter the Soviet Union and China, but for South Africa it was those two countries who were central to what the movement wanted most at the time: inspiration and practical support in fighting back against its system of European domination. After 1955, there were other conferences, as Widan Sena Utama notes in the book, one in Bandung in 1956, which brought together students, and as Carolien Stolte notes in the intro, after 1957, Indians began to pull away from the Cairo-led Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization. 1957, meanwhile, brought Ghana's independence, and as Reem Abu El Fadi notes in her chapter, from the late 1950s, the Afro-Asian project retreated in Africa in the light of the greater attraction of Kwame Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism and Nasser's Afro-Asianism. Nasserite influence would, however, serve to create one enduring connection between South Africa and the Arab and Islamic world. When the Southern African liberation movements adopted armed struggle in the early 1960s, many of the cadres of the ANC's military wing, Mkhonto Sizwe, received training in Egypt and Algeria. One of the lasting cultural artifacts of this connection is the Toy Toy, the jog-trotting dance, which was learned by the Zimbabwe African People's Union from their Algerian trainers and conveyed to the ANC's military wing MK in Angola by their ZAPU comrades before being conveyed by MK cadres to township militants, who have ensured that it has remained a staple of mass mobilization in South African popular politics ever since. The choice for armed struggle and geopolitical shifts in Asia in the early 1960s forced choices on the liberation movements. The most reliable and general sources of sophisticated weaponry were the Eastern Bloc states, and this was a crucial factor in deciding the ANC and ZAPU's allegiance in the Sino-Soviet split during the early 1960s. In his chapter, Ali Raza points to further fragmentation in the Afro-Asian world. He notes the first Solidarity Conference of the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, better known as the Tricontinental Conference, which was held in Havana in 1966. Raza notes, quoting Abdullah Malik, the Pakistani activist, that the conference birthed a new imaginary, that of the Third World, which replaced previous talk of the non-aligned and Africa and Asia being united. Yet Malik also observes that in one sense the Third World actually represented a shrinkage rather than an enlargement of the Afro-Asian imaginary. Yasser Nasser's chapter speaks about the skepticism that the Gandhian economist and political activist J.C. Kumarappa felt about whether Japan ever really belonged in the Afro-Asiatic world owing to its adoption of a Western course of economic development. Tycho van der Hoef, meanwhile, notes that South Korea was at first disinterested in pursuing ties with Africa. Tamo Zhu, meanwhile, notes that following the annihilation of the Communist Party of Indonesia after 1965, Indonesia became a compliant partner of the US-led world order. To return back to Ali Raza, he notes that the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was founded in 1950 by Western intellectuals in Berlin to condemn the Soviet Union, that it had a chapter in Pakistan. In other words, as Ali Raza quotes Abdullah Malik stating, by the late 1950s, the Third World, as it came to be defined at that period, constituted countries struggling to overthrow neocolonialism and struggling for socialism. It was clearly a fragment of the Afro-Asiatic world and not a sum total of all its constituencies, as the Bandung Conference may have intended to develop and generate. There were, in short, multiple opposed Afro-Asian world, except perhaps on the issue of apartheid. In other words, by the 1970s, the condemnation of apartheid and settler colonial rule was one question on which you could see the Afro-Asiatic world speaking as one in international forums. Can you name another? I mean, that's a question that I would raise. And regarding cultural transmission, the Madiba shirt was borrowed from Indonesia, reflecting his relationship with General Suharto. It is the same Mandela who was also friends with Fidel Castro and Muammar Gaddafi. Apartheid was one of the few geopolitical questions I would ask on which Suharto, Castro, and Gaddafi were united from the 1960s onwards. By 1969, the time had come for the ANC to definitively develop its diplomacy of liberation, and the Khartoum conference of that year witnessed a conscious coming together of the so-called authentic Southern African liberation movements. For those involved in the alliance, namely the ANC, ZAPU, the MPLA in Angola and Frelimo, the alliance created a kind of platinum status of those movements who shared the distinction of being OAU recognized, Soviet armed, but with enough residual Afro-Asian support that no Western power would try to isolate them. In the remaining time I've got left, I want to speak about some enduring legacies. Naoka Shimazu notes that by the time of the Bandung Conference's global Golden Jubilee in the early 21st century, the Third World had become referred to as the Global South. The current geopolitical context, meanwhile, raises the further question that may be engaging with, of the extent to which BRICS continues the tradition set by Bandung and the Tricontinental. Does it, or does it reflect the reduction that I spoke about earlier? As Reem Abu El-Fadl notes in her chapter, Egypt had sought to articulate an Afro-Asian agenda linking Palestine with African struggles against settler colonial rule in Rhodesia, Algeria, Kenya, and South Africa. And this connection has arguably had a lasting legacy. Witness recently South Africa making its diplomatic relationship with as important a player as the United States on such a seminal issue as the ongoing war in Europe, contingent on Washington conceding and accepting linkage between the struggles in Palestine and Ukraine. And that leads on to a last question. In my presentation, I acknowledge that there's been a flaw. You've stated a keenness repeatedly to get beyond the high diplomacy manifested at Bandung. For reasons I state, in South Africa, we probably need to get to that level and get to the macro level consideration of how those high level engagements and integration at leadership level influence South African history. When we have, we may join the movement in thinking beyond. In your intro, you write that you were driven by the same spirit of solidarity that motivated the individuals that you studied, working behind the scenes and below the level of senior leaders. So I would ask about the people-to-people contacts of practical solidarity that exist today, and ask about how your ongoing project aims to further them in the future. All that remains for me to say is congratulations on producing such a rich, fertile, intellectually provocative book that will be useful to others, I'm sure, besides myself, in highlighting the transnational extensions of their work, and hopefully by their engagement they will hopefully provide aid to you in your ongoing project in tracing the ways in which the post-World War II era saw activists in the Afro-Asian world try to connect these two regions of the continent. Thank you very much for your time.